February 14th, 1933. Bumpy Johnson was outnumbered 12 to 1. 12 guns. One single bulb swinging above a concrete stairwell. Footsteps on rough wood. The sound of safeties being eased back like a metronome. That was the set. That was the stake. What came back up those stairs hours later was a single man, crawling, bleeding, clutching a playing card soaked dark, and a message that would be read in every room that mattered in Harlem. Harlem in 1933 was a city within a city. The Great Depression had hollowed out opportunities, but the numbers racket pulsed as a lifeline for hundreds, an informal lottery that turned a few coins into hopes of a break. It was more than profit. It was community ritual, gossip, credit, sometimes survival. Running numbers was local power dressed as math. The people who ran it controlled jobs, favors, and information. Take that away and a neighborhood lost more than money. At the center of that economy, for a time, stood Madame Stephanie St. Clair, often called simply Madame. She sold solace and odds, and she had a code. She also had Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson as her enforcer. Bumpy was not a brute caricature. He had spent stretches behind bars, taught himself by reading the law and books, and carried himself with a calm that felt like calculation. Witnesses and later interviews painted him as literate, deliberate, and fierce in defense of his turf, a man whose reputation was as carefully maintained as any ledger. Across town, Dutch Schultz lurched toward a different calculus. Dutch, Adolf Schultz to some records, later known as Dutch, was a Bronx boss who had built his name in bootlegging and violence. With prohibition unraveling and law enforcement tightening, Dutch's profits were under pressure. The numbers in Harlem looked like an answer. To him, Harlem's lottery was a machine that could be seized, skimmed, and integrated into his wider rackets. That was the motive put forward by many contemporaneous accounts: money, leverage, and the kind of ambition that thought any local empire could be bought. Madame refused, or at least she refused at first. Accounts vary on the exact words, but the refusal happened the way refusals did in the underworld, not as a polite decline, but as a refusal backed by its own force. Bumpy stood with her. He had reasons beyond simple loyalty. The racket protected neighborhoods and people who paid into it. To hand Harlem to an outsider was to hand it to a man willing to burn anything to make a point. If you love these forgotten true crime moments, hit subscribe. Dutch sent men. Reports say 12 came from his command, killers whose names flicker in oral histories and police notes. Tommy, reported as the executioner. A few others named in later retellings as Vento and Icepick, reported. And a handful of hired muscle whose identities were never solidly recorded in the press. Some names only exist because a reporter decades later scribbled them down after hearing the story from someone who swore they were there. The plan, according to those accounts, was simple and brutal. Go into the Cotton Club basement, find the enforcer, end the resistance. The Cotton Club itself carried a different life upstairs. Music, laughter, the kind of jazz-soaked glamour Harlem exported across the city. Downstairs was where business could get ugly out of the public eye. Narrow passages, storage crates, cellar stairs that worked in favor of anyone who knew them. It was a place of echoes, a place that returned your sound a beat later, registering every footfall twice. Bumpy went down alone, the stories say. He descended the steep, narrow stairs with a cigarette trimmed to a nub or sometimes without one, depending on which report you read. There, in the amber of a single bulb, the dozen men waited. The bulb was the room's heart. Small, vulnerable. Safeties clicked. Conversations ate the light. How the confrontation began is where archive and legend braid together. Some accounts, those collected by later reporters and oral historians, said that Bumpy counted them, the way a chess player counts pieces before a move. Others claim he taunted them, voice low and deliberate. Still others say he simply moved, and the darkness swallowed what happened next. The details diverge, but the shape of the moment is consistent. The bulb shattered. Some witnesses insisted Bumpy threw the first blow. Some said it was a stray bullet. "He broke the bulb" is a line that recurs in multiple retellings, and it matters because it changed everything. Darkness turned a room of prepared marks into chaos. Shots fired without target. Hands grappled where eyes could not guide them. Bumpy, according to those who knew him and to the oral record, had an advantage. He knew the precise layout of the cellar. Where crates stood, the step that creaked, the low beam that could be used to wedge someone. He had trained his reflexes in cramped, violent places. Accounts say he fought without a gun. He used his body, his timing, and the room itself to even the odds. Keep in mind, parts of this sequence belong to legend as much as to record. A later reporter who interviewed surviving witnesses decades after the fact supplied many of the vivid details. The bulb breaking, the feel of fabric in a closed fist, the way one man found his throat cut with no one fully able to say who had done it. Those recollections are valuable and vivid, but they are recollections. Contemporary police reports and newspapers captured different slants. Some described a shootout. Others noted the difficulty of piecing together what had happened in a cellar that looked like a tornado had passed through it. Short blows. A body slumped into a stack of crates. A muffled curse. A scuffle that rolled across the concrete and vanished into the dark. It did not last long, but events compressed into a handful of intense, terrible minutes. 11 men were effectively taken out. Whether dead, wounded, or incapacitated varied between reports, and one man crawled out. Marty Delaney, reported, is the name that comes down to us as that single returned figure. His presence is the part of the story that stitched the night into something more than a local gunfight. According to later interviews and press reports, the surviving man managed, somehow, to drag himself out of the cellar in the early light. He was bloodied and exhausted. He had on him, clutched in a fist that trembled with pain, a playing card, the ace of spades. It had been smeared with blood. What he told Dutch, as quoted in later accounts, was short and terrible. Harlem was not for sale. The card was a message. One retelling, the one that hardened into legend, has Marty saying something like, "He's collecting a deck." That phrase, "he's collecting a deck," appears in multiple oral histories. It arrived as part dare, part promise, part warning. The ace of spades had its weight as symbol. In gangland semiotics, a single card could be an omen. The ace of spades, darker and more iconic, carried a particular chill. Dutch read the message. He calculated. He was not a man to be swayed by theater alone, but he was a man who understood cost. A war with Harlem would not be a narrow fight. It would draw law, public attention, and the kind of local backlash that could unravel his other enterprises. More than that, it would force him to commit resources he could not spare indefinitely. Accounts suggest that Dutch stepped back, not out of honor, not because of a newfound respect for community codes, but because the ledger did not balance in his favor. There is nuance here. Pulling back did not mean peace. Dutch continued to be violent elsewhere. He continued to expand and to make enemies, eventually dying in 1935 in a hit that some historians trace to mob politics of the time. But for Harlem, that night and the ace that came with it marked a turning point. It was a moment when blunt force met strategy, where a local enforcer turned familiarity with place and reputation into defense stronger than hired arms. The ace itself accumulated meaning. Some accounts, reportedly, say Bumpy framed that card and hung it as a trophy, a warning to anyone who mistook Harlem for an open market. Other versions insist that the card's journey into legend began less materially, through gossip and retelling, until it became emblematic. Either way, the card became shorthand of a lesson delivered: respect the code or feel the consequence. What happened beneath the club remained, for many years, both a fact and a fable. Oral historians, community elders, and reporters who revisited the story decades on offered overlapping, sometimes contradictory scenes. Some said Bumpy had men with him who locked the basement door from above and let the darkness do the rest. A dramatic touch that is not present in contemporary police notes. Others insisted he had actually gone down alone, which made his survival and that night's outcome far more a product of personal skill and local knowledge than of planning alone. The safest way to tell it is to say, accounts vary, and much of the night passed out of reach of official record into memory. The aftermath turned Bumpy from an enforcer into a protector in the local imagination. He did what local strongmen sometimes did. He mixed fear with practical oversight. He wasn't just a man with a temper. He was a figure who policed predatory outsiders as much as he policed his own. He enforced a kind of order that, for many in Harlem, felt preferable to the chaos that might come from being a pawn of larger criminal syndicates. That transformation fed legend. Newspaper stories and later biographies leaned into the dramatic. The man who read law in prison becomes the man who outthinks a would-be conqueror. The homegrown protector beats back the moneyed gangster. There is truth in that arc, but also simplification. Bumpy's life after 1933 remained enmeshed in crime. He ran protection, collected debts, and engaged in the kind of activities that kept him in conflict with police and rival gangs alike. He was a protector in one sense and a criminal in another. Some specific names and details connected to the night remain fragile. The hitmen who went down to the cellar, the so-called Tommy, Vento, Icepick in later retellings, appear in oral accounts and decades-late interviews, but contemporary documentation is thinner. Marty Delaney's survival story is reported in later press reconstructions. The way the bulb came down, who struck the first blow, and the number of fatalities are all filtered through memory and the imperfect appetite of newspapers. Scholars who piece this together caution that the story lives in that gray area where historical record meets theater. And yet, for Harlem, the story had a practical effect. Whether by calculation, reputation, or the math of cost and consequence, Dutch shifted focus. Whether he was humiliated or merely deterred, he ceased to press hard into the numbers game in Harlem in a way that suggested a different risk assessment. For Bumpy, the event became one tile in a mosaic that made him untouchable in many eyes. The Ace of Spades worked as both artifact and allegory. The card was a message that played out in action and rumor, a tiny object that carried an outsized consequence. Legend grows in the telling. Some tellers dramatize scenes to emphasize a moral. Brains beat brawn. The local code, when enforced by someone who understood law and streets, could outmaneuver a bigger, blunter force. Others lean into the mythic quality of the story. A single card, a single survivor, one decisive night. If you listen closely to all of the retellings, you hear a consistent note. Reputation is currency, and the ways people spend it determine more than respect. They determine survival. Bumpy carried his reputation forward for decades. He remained a prominent figure in Harlem, later arrested and released at various points, and his name threaded through newspapers for years until his death in 1968, reported. The framed stories and trophies people associate with him, the Ace of Spades among them, became part of the neighborhood's lore. Whether the card hung on a wall or lived mainly in story, its power lay in being repeated. Every mention reinforced the idea that Harlem would not be sold cheaply. There are lessons layered under the drama. One is practical. Familiarity with place and people can be a decisive advantage when brute force expects a straightforward victory. Another is cultural. Communities create their own systems of leverage and defense. Underestimating those systems has consequences. A final lesson is about myth-making itself. Sometimes a single image, a card, a framed object, a line whispered over coffee, becomes the hinge on which a whole reputation turns. History rarely delivers neat endings. Dutch paid the price of violent life in his own time and way. Bumpy's path remained complicated and morally knotted. The night in the Cotton Club basement sits between those lives as a flashpoint. A moment where intent met resistance, where strategy turned a killing field into a cautionary tale, and where one returned with a message that would alter calculations across a city block. So the title's claim, 12 cent, one returned with a chilling message, is shorthand for a longer, messier truth. The numbers fit one part of the story, the card fits another. And the legends, the reports and the facts braided together, leave us with a scene that feels cinematic because it is about theater as much as warfare. Men gathered for a decisive blow, a single object turned into a warning, the aftermath reshaping future choices. If you take anything from this, let it be this image, a dim cellar, a shattered bulb, and a man crawling into daylight with an ace of spades pressed into a bleeding hand. It is not simply a story of violence. It is a lesson about how place, reputation, and the willingness to fight on another's terms can change history. Or at least the history people tell about it. Drop a like if you think Bumpy outplayed Dutch. Comment, what would you have done if you were in Dutch's shoes? And if you want the next forgotten true crime story from the margins of history, subscribe and come back for the next one.